thanks for joining us. Welcome to Close Up. I'm Josh McKelvin. We are on the set, Studio B of our Granite State Debate Series. It wrapped up on Friday night after a long week for a lot of folks, a lot of candidates, but it's important stuff. I am joined by the Reporter Roundtable, going from right to left, partner here at WMUR, John DeStaso, Kevin Landrigan, the Union Leader, Josh Rogers of NHPR. So let's start with the first debate of this week. That was the Republican governor's debate, and there was a lot of back and forth in this one. We're going to check in with it, especially Jeannie Forster talking about opioids and the response to it.
Quite honestly, I'm surprised that you wouldn't want to use all the tools available as governor to make sure we end this crisis.
We've used every tool in the toolbox here in Manchester.
I don't think so.
And I think, Senator, that when you talk about what are we going to do, it's not...
What are you going to do?
Well, Senator, I know that you're much more respectful in that.
We know that there are many patients who have suffered from chronic pain for years, and they have been treated well with opiates. And so if we can make sure that individuals are informed and that doctors are informed, and so that there's a responsible use of the drugs, then I don't think we have a problem.
I do support immigration, but I believe we need to make sure those immigrants are properly vetted before they come into the state.
When I went up to the governor's council and you were there, and I asked for a moratorium on refugees, you voted against it. That's perception and reality.
The moratorium on refugees back in 2011 had nothing to do with the 10,000 Syrian refugees that President Obama was purporting to bring in.
All right, now we all came into this debate expecting them to mix it up, and they did mix it up pretty good. Start with you, John. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, my biggest takeaway would be that Jeannie Forster drew a lot of attention that night, for better or for worse. On the one hand, she was definitely the aggressor, the most aggressive candidate in that debate, and she needed to be because, let's face it, she's viewed as having some ground to make up.
Sure.
But she did this kind of controversial issue, started this issue that lasted throughout the rest of the week about using the National Guard on the borders, and that started
that
sparked some people kind of scoffing at her. My other takeaway on this was Chris Sununu kind of played the rope-a-dope, the front-runner role, and no one's really sure if he really is the front runner. We're going to find that.
That's the thought. Most people thought it was going to be Sununu and Gatsis going after each other, and they did a little bit. But what's your thought? Did this have any impact on what we see on Tuesday?
Yeah, Josh, they did a little bit, but I thought it was a good night for Chris Sununu. Here's why. Not a particularly overwhelming performance by him during the debate, but when Gatsis is being put on the defensive by another candidate, that's a good night for Chris Sununu. And as we saw, as John pointed out, this story played out over 4 days, ended with the end of the week with Manchester Police Chief and all these other officials signing a letter saying Manchester's not a city under siege. This has been all overblown, and for Forster, that's a very good thing, because I mean, here's a candidate, attention and earned media, as they say. When you're the candidate with 1/4 of the amount of money that Ted Gatsis has in this race. But Jeannie Forster, that's the money's milk of politics.
What about you, Josh? Obviously, Frank Edelblut tried to break through a little bit, came across, talking a lot about policy, but didn't get to play afterwards.
Well, we'll see. He's obviously been popular with, core Republican activists of the libertarian variety. I was going to the debate expecting Ted Gatsis to be going after Chris Sununu, which did happen to some extent. I mean, he tried to do that from the outset, but it was mainly, Forster and Gatsis. And, Edelblut carved out very conservative positions. We saw what he said about drugs. When he was asked about guns and people who are mentally ill, he had, a very pure position. Mental illness isn't a crime. Their Second Amendment rights shouldn't be abridged. That's going to win votes among staunch conservatives. How well that translates beyond that?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting here, but go ahead.
John and Josh probably heard the same thing, but internally from other Republicans who are doing polling this week, they were telling me that actually Edelblut is the candidate on the move. Is that Edelblut is still in 3rd place in polls, but he was moving. And that's one of the reasons why, at the beginning of the week, Gatsis went so negative against Sununu. Here's why. Gatsis, I think, intuitively understands, I'm not going to win this primary on my own vote. I need to take more from someone else. He can't take it from Edelblut. He's too conservative and too doctrinaire. But he can take it from Sununu. That's why he went nuclear, and Sununu, of course, responded.
Yeah, it was quite a debate. We went back-to-back on Monday night. The Democratic candidates for governor on stage as well. And we're talking about 3 guys, really, that, people haven't really met yet. Let's put it that way. And they really did their best to try to introduce themselves. We'll start here from...
I am the progressive choice for governor. I'm the only one here that voted for Bernie this spring. I'm the only one 100% against both Northern Pass and the death penalty. I'm the only one with a plan for paid family leave.
I've been endorsed in this race by a majority of all Democratic state lawmakers in the state of New Hampshire, and most of both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton steering committees in the state.
I have some 40 years experience in the private and public sectors, and I fought and won for New Hampshire families. That's the kind of leadership I will bring to the governor's office.
All right, so despite the low name ID for all of them, I guess the conventional thought is Colin Van Oster might beat the front runner in this. What was your takeaway? Anything change?
I thought Steve Marchand acquitted himself well in the debate. I've heard that from Democrats I've spoken with. Colin Van Oster was a competent performance. You could sense that a lot of his answers were rehearsed and very precise diction and at times a little robotic, but he has core support. He's a smart tactical politician. That's his background. Is as a campaign staffer before some of the business things he's done. And Mark Connolly, I thought he did well as well. I mean, there isn't a huge. I mean, there are some differences on how explicit they are about what sort of revenues they're going to raise or are open to raising, but there's really more stylistic difference than substantive ones.
And the legalization, Steve Marchand of recreational marijuana came out of the gate before we even had a chance to ask him.
Yeah, he does, and he that's one of his big issues in terms of raising revenue. The thing that I thought that Marchand had a very good debate, probably the best debate out of the three. Again, Colin seemed confident that he has sort of the organization and the ability to get out the vote from his days as a strategist and as someone who has run campaigns and is now a candidate. We're in a low turnout primary. He feels confident that he can get his vote out.
Yeah, I think for Colin, he's got to hope, though, the Secretary of State Bill Gardner is right. As he told you folks at the end of the week, 86,000 Democrats will vote on Tuesday. That'd be the third largest in history. If it's that big, then Austin, I think, is clearly likely the winner. If it's much smaller than that, and I've heard some activists think it could be as low as 60,000. If it's that small, that's a very, very liberal base in that party. They want legalization of marijuana. They want a mandatory seatbelt law and a mandatory helmet law. They want more money spent and more taxes raised. And they're not getting those answers from Van Osten as well as Connolly and Marchand are giving to those folks.
Steve Marchand obviously was the only candidate who just put right out there, he voted for Bernie. He said that several times during the debate. Even though, in the past he's been a so-called no labels problem solver. He's been Concord Coalition. He's been sort of a moderate Democrat in some ways, but now he's saying that he's the most progressive Democrat. And I think tapping into the Bernie Sanders, movement here, which still is in existence, was definitely a smart move.
And he doesn't have the financial resources that Connolly or Van Osten has to, so it certainly makes sense from that point of view as well.
Well, and as far as the projections go, I'm never going to second-guess Secretary of State Bill Gardner, but a lot of people were surprised at the number that he put out there. We'll see what happens, but it's an election cycle unlike any other so far. Next night, obviously, we had the Senate debate between Jim Rubins and Kelly Ayotte. We expected Jim Rubins to be aggressive right off the bat. He was. Here's a little bit of it.
You give hostage payments to the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world, and guess what? They took 3 more American hostages.
These Iran deals negotiated by the Obama administration have been abysmal, probably the worst negotiations that we've seen in many, many years. Bipartisan capitulation doesn't work. She's got an F from Conservative Review. She's got a 27. She votes like Annie Kuster, a liberal Democrat in the second CD.
Let me go back to my time as Attorney General. First appointed by a Republican governor, twice reappointed by a Democrat governor, and I worked across the aisle then on getting things done to keep the people of New Hampshire safe. This is part of my DNA.
And so what we just heard, Kelly Ayotte actually starting with the Iran deal. That's what you wanted to do in this debate, so she could talk about Hillary Clinton and then, as a result, Maggie Hassan. What was your takeaway?
Well, she did her best to ignore Jim Rubins. She mentioned his name, I think, once, maybe twice, and Jim Rubins was on the attack. I thought she was a little rehearsed, shall we say, to be nice about it. And not saying she had a bad night.
But careful.
She's going to do well. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of a vote Jim Rubins gets. Will he break in the double digits? Will he be in the high?
Obviously, a huge underdog. And it would
absolutely. But for Kelly Ayotte, I mean, I don't see that this debate hurt her, except for, she probably could have been a little more spontaneous in some of her answers, a little more human.
Not assuming anything, but when people watched this debate, what were they thinking about how this was going to play for Kelly Ayotte against Maggie Hassan in the general?
Yeah, I think And I think that's what Kelly Ayotte was focused on. I would agree that wasn't the best performance I've seen her give, and she'll never be a superb debater. That's just not her bailiwick. But she mentioned Hassan more than 24 times during the debate. She kept contrasting her versus Hassan. I think a lot of viewers wanted to hear that, wanted to see that. That's what's interesting to me. We're talking about one of the most expensive races in New Hampshire history. We're talking about one of the closest U.S. Senate races in history. And both of these candidates, Maggie Hassan and Kelly Ayotte, I don't think quite are ready for the Klieg lights that are going to happen after Tuesday.
They got to be feeling enormous pressure. $55 million and counting on this race of outside money.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, they've got to both be feeling it. What was your takeaway from the debate moving forward towards the general?
Well, we heard some of the things that Kelly Ayotte's going to be saying moving forward, that, you know, she's a bipartisan, you know, it's in her DNA, which I expect we'll hear more of. And she likes to, you know, she didn't really answer the questions terribly directly about her record when she got elected versus her focus on bipartisanship as an election gets close. But, you know, we heard her make the case that she's the most one of the more bipartisan senators. We're going to hear a lot of that. And, you know, there's a lot of yoking of Maggie Hassan and Hillary Clinton, and there's obviously going to be a lot of tying of Kelly Ayotte to Donald Trump, and you know, we're going to have weeks of that. So.
Right. No, this isn't over. No, there's no question about it.
Say debate style, I think Kelly's advantage is Maggie, the governor, is not the greatest debater either. You're going to have two candidates who are going to be, you know, kind of rehearsed. It'd be interesting to see in that general election debate, assuming Kelly Ayotte wins on Tuesday, if there's any spontaneity that can be brought out of either of them, to be honest with you.
And maybe another way to describe it could be very disciplined and careful on the part of both of them, and it comes across like, you know, they're not spontaneous during the debate. Focus is another word too. Now, one race that has flown under the radar largely throughout this whole thing, the second CD the following night between Jim Rubens and between Jim Lawrence and Jack Flanagan, Republican primary. Nobody knows who these guys are, but they had a pretty interesting debate. They sparred over a couple of different issues, including gun violence.
My opponent has shown a tendency to say something, to talk tough talk when it comes to supporting the Second Amendment, but unfortunately, when it comes to support those issues, he hasn't always been there.
The reality is he's filling out surveys, okay? I'm actually introducing legislation.
Now, this is a race that could be the closest race of all of them. Who knows? What was your take?
What was interesting to me, Josh, was both these guys think they're going to win on Tuesday. And so until this debate, they both were kind of playing patty cake with one another, parroting their own positions very often, very little contrast. That's what was great about this debate. I thought a lot of good tension on entitlement spending, on Obamacare, on, as we just saw, gun violence. I thought both candidates rose to the occasion. And frankly, they're going to have to. Because Donald Trump, if he wins the 2nd congressional district vote, will be the first Republican since 1988 to win in the 2nd district. That's what this nominee is up against, not just Andy Custer. It's the profile of this district in the presidential election.
We'll see. Obviously, the congressional race everybody was looking at, though, was, you know, on Friday night, Frank Ginta, Rich Ashew. Frank Ginta's had his, you know, the cloud of the FEC scandal hanging over him. Rich Ashew still trying to introduce himself to a lot of people. Here's a little bit of that debate.
We've learned that he's broken the law, lied about it, and every major Republican called for his resignation. So clearly some things have changed, and trust and integrity matter. They matter to me. It's top of my list. So if Frank was to admit that he broke the law, admit that he lied about it, and apologize to the voters, then I'd consider supporting him.
Obviously, you get a rebuttal, same question.
Look, at the beginning of this debate, I said he was going to try to impugn my integrity and character, attack me personally and my family, and he's proving me right. The bottom line is, whoever wins this primary, I will be endorsing and supporting, because we cannot have Carol Shea Porter as the next member of Congress representing the 1st Congressional District. As I said before, I'm a team player. Clearly, Rich is not willing to make that commitment, and that's unfortunate.
All right, that was an answer to the question of, would you support the other if they win? Josh, what was your thought when you were watching this debate?
Well, I thought that both of them did pretty well given where they stand in this race. I thought it was a reasonably good debate for Rich Ashew, who at times has probably suffered in this campaign from being insufficiently aggressive. And Frank Ginta, given the road he's got to walk, you know, he's got down it. I mean, he's certainly very brazen in addressing the campaign finance scandal. I think he believes that voters aren't particularly interested in that. I mean, he was confronted with video clips of past statements that, you know, were found to be untruthful. He didn't really address those, but just said, I'm an outsider. He's an incumbent, but, you know, he's running as an anti-establishment figure. You know, we'll see how that goes Tuesday.
Despite the long history, I mean, he blames, you know, the media in a way, and he blames his opponent. And yet, I agree with Josh that he seems to have convinced himself that it's not an issue and that he has nothing really to explain, which is surprising in some ways. I thought he had, you know, I think his whole campaign has been exceeding expectations, despite the numbers that show him very much underwater.
I want to ask you this. Well, you say exceeding expectations.
Well, I think a lot of people thought that Rich Ashley would walk away with this.
Exactly.
And that's what brings me to my next point. A lot of people were wondering if Rich Ashley wasn't meeting expectations, going after Frank Ginta hard enough, making public trust the issue in this race.
Yep.
Did he do enough of it in this debate, Kevin?
I think he did well in this debate, and I think he looked congressional. I really do. I do think he stumbled on one point, and that is Frank Ginta said at one point, I can't find too much that my opponent disagrees with me. And there are issues on which they disagree. And Ashew failed to pick up on that, because at the end of the day, this is about throwing an incumbent out of office, and you've got to have a reason. And is a 6-year-old, you know, campaign finance scandal enough? We'll find out on Tuesday.
And I was just going to say, in the relatively low turnout primary, it's going to be the Second Amendment question. I think was very, very big in this, where Frank Ginta really distinguished himself on that, and that could be a problem for Rich Ashew.
Well, we'll see. Frank Ginta obviously is still dealing with favorability issues that incumbents shouldn't have to deal with. But you know what? Again, this is an election cycle. We can't predict anything lately.
Exactly.
So it's going to be interesting what we're talking about next week when we do this. Right. Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Appreciate that.